I reframed the question a bit to say, what are some key considerations when growing businesses are deciding how to structure ownership of their intellectual property across different entities or business lines? So IP ownership is a critical decision that businesses face, and where they want to house that intellectual property is a critical part of the business. Not just from an operation standpoint and an asset ownership standpoint, but from a tax standpoint and a revenue standpoint, the type of revenues that you're getting from that intellectual property. So let's see, we're dealing with different business entity types. You can have LLCs. From a tax standpoint, LLC doesn't mean anything. Federal government does not recognize LLC as a type of entity. So LLC is choosing another taxation type. It could be one of the corporate taxation types, an S corp or a C corp. You could be taxed as a partnership. You could be a nonprofit. We have nonprofits that own intellectual property, particularly trademarks. And the interesting thing about a nonprofit owning intellectual property, whether it's a trademark or a patent or copyrights, is that you can only, because that entity is a nonprofit, it can only be given to another nonprofit, or it has to be sold for fair market value. So whenever you wind down a nonprofit or you sell any of the intellectual property in a nonprofit, what you've got to do is you've got to get a valuation if you're going to sell it, or you have to give it to another nonprofit. Those are your only two choices. And this is something that a lot of nonprofits are not aware of when it comes to their intellectual property assets. They don't realize that they can't just transfer it. They can't just file an assignment unless they're transferring it over to another nonprofit. This is true whether you're winding down or whether you are just dealing with that particular asset. The other thing you have to be careful of is what are you doing with the intellectual property, especially if a nonprofit owns it. If a nonprofit is the holder and owner of that asset, then are they licensing it to a for-profit entity? Are they letting a for-profit entity use it? So you've got to be sure that you're not sort of giving away intellectual property in a way that runs afoul of IRS regulations. What are other business entity types? There's nonprofit, but then there's not-for-profit, which is a totally different business entity type that people often confuse with a nonprofit. A not-for-profit is more akin to, for example, if you have like a social club that you're a part of, that's sort of a hobby, a group of people with a hobby, but you are doing activities and you incur some communal business expenses and you maybe actually take dues or something like that, then you may choose to form a not-for-profit to help protect people who are part of it. But your goal is not to make money. It's really just to manage liabilities so that individuals are not getting themselves in trouble just for engaging in a robust hobby with a bunch of other people. That's not really what we're talking about here. Okay, nonprofit is different. And then you've got public benefit entities. It can be an LLC or a corporation. All of these have tax implications, and it really depends on what do you want to do with that intellectual property. Do you want to license it out and make revenues from royalties that are generally you're dealing with a different tax rate? Do you want to hold it? Do you want to sell it? I've had clients where they would have inventions and then they knew larger companies would infringe and they would just wait. And then they would sell or license out that intellectual property to people who would pursue infringement claims against those companies. You know, it was just their nature to invent things. They never wanted to actually manufacture and produce, but they knew that large companies would just say, well, we don't care if somebody else owns this invention, we will use it anyway. And they would say, great, bet, let's do this. Let me find somebody who will pursue that infringement. But who they were as a person was just someone who would prolifically invent things, just invent things. So really depends on what you want to do with that intellectual property. And I would say the biggest thing to be careful of is over engineering your structure. A lot of that will depend on what resources do you have to commit to it, especially your time resources to actually build it in the way that you desire. If you've got a serious restriction on resources, then you may not want to start with an over-engineered initial structure. You may want to let it grow over time.